10. The king summoned the commander Ahmose and said to him, I will entrust to you, O commander, the western coast of Thebes, so attack or besiege it as you see fit, drawing your plans from the circumstances surrounding you. The men began to think about how to attack Thebes, and Commander Moab said, the walls of Thebes are impregnable and extremely strong, costing the attackers dear lives, but there is no need to attack them, as their southern gates are the only way to them. Commander Thebes said, besieging fortified cities and starving them is more beneficial for the attackers than attacking them, but we cannot think for a single moment about starving Thebes, so we have nothing left but to attack its walls, and we do not lack the means to attack the walls, such as ladders and protective domes. But it is not enough either, and we hope that we will receive ample quantities of it. In any case, if the price of goodness is expensive, we will give it willingly. Ahmose said, this is the opinion, so we should not waste our time because our people are confined within the walls of the city, and they are likely to be exposed to the vengeance of our brutal enemy. On that day, the Egyptian fleet advanced towards the western shore of Thebes and met in front of it a fleet of shepherds gathered from ships fleeing from Hierakonpolis. It closed in on it and the two fleets clashed in a violent battle, but the Egyptians were greatly outnumbered in the number of men and ships, so they tightened the noose on their enemy and covered him with fierce fire. Ahmose sent vanguards from teams of bowmen and spearmen to test the defending forces. They fired their bows at distant points on the Great Wall. Suddenly, the shepherds filled the wall with strong guards and endless weapons. The Egyptian commanders were organizing their forces. When the order to attack was issued to them, they sent successive battalions of their men throughout the valley to attack the wall in distant points, taking cover with its long shields. The enemy's arrows rained down on them like a torrent, and they aimed their bows at the outlets of the impenetrable wall. And the fighting took place without mercy, and the camp kept sending groups of soldiers ready to fight, and they were fighting with a boldness that did not fear death, so they paid dearly for their audacity, and it ended. The day broke with a massive massacre, and the king was horrified by the sight of the dead and wounded, so he shouted angrily, my soldiers do not care about death, and death is reaping them. Ha said, as he looked at the square with a blurry look, what a battle, my lord. I see corpses filling the square. The leader, Moab, had a frowning face and disheveled clothes. He said, are we not openly attacking death? Ahmose said, I will not push my army to certain destruction, and it would be better for me to send a limited number of men behind the protective domes, until death fills the enemy's openings in its wall. The king remained agitated, and what the messengers conveyed did not relieve him of the fact that the Egyptian fleet had seized the rest of the shepherd's fleet and had become the undisputed master of the Nile. That evening, the messenger whom he had sent to his family returned in Nabatta carrying a letter from Tututuri, so Ahmose spread the letter in his hands and read. What follows? From Tututuri to my grandson and my lord, Pharaoh of Egypt, Ahmose bin Ahmose, to whom I pray to the noble Lord to preserve his precious life, direct his mind to payment, his heart to faith, and his hand to the killing of his enemy. Your messenger came to me to mourn for us our valiant deceased Ahmose and to inform me of his last word addressed to me, and to do me good deeds. While you are fighting our enemy, I refrain from mentioning what our hearts are all beating for my heart has been destined to taste death twice in one short life. But there is no consolation for one who lives in the furnace of a massive battle in which souls are sacrificed cheaply and the brave are spared to death, and I will not conceal from you. Despite my pain and sadness, a messenger seeking me with the death of Camus and the victory of our army is more beloved to me than for Camus to come to me with news of defeat. So go on your path, and you will be protected by the care of the merciful Lord, and you will be protected by the supplication of my heart and the tender hearts gathered around me, struggling with grief, patience, and hope, and know, my lord, that we are striving travel to the town of Thebes, close to the borders of our country, so that we may be closer to your messengers, and peace. Ahmose read the book and discovered what lay behind its lines of excruciating pain and fervent hope. The faces he had bid farewell to in Nabatta appeared to him, Tututuri with her thin, grey-haired face, Ahatepe's grandmother with her majesty and sadness, his mother Sichimose with her meekness, and his wife Nefertari with her wide eyes and graceful figure, and he murmured, saying, O my God! Totisheri receives the stabs of deadly pain with solace and hope, and her sadness does not make her forget our desired hope. So I will always remember her wisdom and follow her with my mind and heart. 11. The fleet carried out its duty after capturing the shepherd's fleet. He laid siege around the western shore of the city, and spread terror among the owners of the palaces overlooking the Nile, and he exchanged arrows with the forts of the beaches. But he did not attempt to attack these forts due to their invincibility and their height due to the decline of the Nile in the harvest season, so he contented himself with skirmishing with them and laying siege around them, and Ahmose himself was in conflict with him. To the southern shore of the country where the fishermen reside, and a tender heart beats for him, and he thought that this place might be his gateway to Thebes, but the shepherds were more cautious than he thought, so they took the shore from the Egyptians, and occupied its extended area with armored guards. As for King Ahmose, he refrained from attacking in large groups, and presented to the field an elite group of his men trained behind long shields. They stayed with the defenders of the Great Wall in a war based on art and precision aiming. They did not hesitate to show their traditional skill and high efficiency, and the war continued in this manner for a few days without to herald any result or predict any end, so the king became restless and said, "We should not give the enemy a period in which to restore its system and rebuild a new force of its wheels." Then Ahmose tightened the hilt of his sword and said, "I will order the resumption of the violent attack, and if the sacrifice of souls is not necessary, let us present ourselves as befits men who have sworn to liberate Egypt from the heavy yoke of its enemy. I will direct my messengers to the rulers of the south to urge them to make siege shields and protective domes." The king issued his order for the attack, and personally supervised the distribution of teams of bows and spears in the spacious field in the form of a heart and two wings, and he placed Commander Moab on the starboard, and Commander Deeb on the left, and the Egyptians proceeded to advance in large waves, the wave not catching up with the previous ones until this one had taken its place and subsided. The enemy, sheltering in the formidable wall, fought against each other. When daylight advanced, the field was full of soldiers pressing against the wall of Thebes. The Egyptians were able to inflict a heavy loss on their enemy, and they also lost a large number of their men. But their loss, in any case, was less than the loss of the first day, and the fighting took place like this for a few more days, and the number of deaths increased on both sides. And the pressure of the enemy's right wing of the Egyptians intensified until it was once able to silence one of the many defense points, and to destroy everyone who confronted the shooting of arrows from its ports. Some brave officers took advantage of this opportunity and attacked that direction with their soldiers. They set up an attack ladder and climbed it with a valiant force, while the arrows of their brothers covered them like clouds. The shepherds noticed the threatened area, so they multiplied on it and applied the attackers to a fierce fire until they annihilated them. The king was pleased with this attack, which set a wonderful example for his army. And he said to those around him, "For the first time since the beginning of the siege, a group of my soldiers has been killed on the wall of Thebes." In fact, this step had a great significance, as it was repeated on the second day. Then it took place the next day at 2 points on the wall, and the Egyptians' pressure on the enemy continued to increase until the invasion became a hoped-for hope soon. Meanwhile, a messenger came from shore, the ruler of Syene, at the head of a force of heavily armed soldiers who had finally been trained, and with them was a ship loaded with siege shields, ladders, and a number of protective domes. The king received the soldiers with joy, and his hope for victory doubled. He ordered them to be marched into the field in front of his camp to greet them. The soldiers become more hopeful and stronger. In the morning, the fighting took place in a terrible manner, and the Egyptians continued their sincere attacks, and they faced death with hearts that did not fear it, and they inflicted heavy losses on their enemy until he appeared exhausted and desperate, and his arms were numb. Commander Moab was able to say to his master as he was returning from the field, "My lord, we will storm the wall tomorrow." The pimp all agreed on this, so Ahmose sent a messenger to his family inviting them to Habu, where the Egyptian flag was flying, so that they could all enter Thebes in the near future, and the king spent the night with strong faith and great hope. 12. The dawn of the promised day came, and the Egyptians woke up ecstatic, jumping, their beating hearts anticipating the tune of war and victory. Then their crowds advanced to their places behind shields and domes, and looked at their targets in anger. They saw a wondrous sight that they had not expected to see. They were filled with astonishment and annoyance, and they exchanged looks of bewilderment and astonishment. They saw on the wall, around the ocean, naked bodies were tied up. They saw Egyptian women and their young children. The shepherds took them as shields to protect them from the evil of their arrows and missiles. They stood behind them, laughing and gloating. The sight of the naked women with their hair untied and their honor torn, and the young children with their hands and feet tied, would disintegrate all of their livers, let alone the livers of those who were their husbands and their children, so they fell into the hands of the men and their arms were paralyzed. Discomfort spread throughout the souls until it reached the king, and he received it as if it were a bolt from the sky, and he shouted angrily, "What barbaric brutality! The cowards take shelter in the bodies of women and children." Silence and gloom prevailed among the king's entourage and his commanders, and none of them said a word. Then the morning light rose and they saw in the distance a wall of Thebes protected by the bodies of women and children. Their bodies shivered with horror, their faces turned yellow with anger, their limbs trembled, and their souls hovered around the tortured prisoners and their brave families who stood in the field in front of them with their arms folded. They suffer from torment and are distressed by helplessness, and Ha shouted in a shaky voice, "O wretches, the succession of day and night will kill them if their hearts are not torn by arrows." The king was bewildered, and he began to look at the captives who were protecting their enemy with their bodies and children with astonished and gloomy eyes. What could he do? The struggle of long months threatens with loss, and the hopes of 10 years threaten with disappointment and despair, so what can he do? Did he come to save his people or to harm them, and was he sent as mercy or punishment? He began to mutter in his sadness, "Aman. Aman, my worshipped Lord, this struggle is for your face and for those who believe in you, so inspire me to do what is right so that I find a way out for myself." He was alerted from his prayer to the sound of a will coming from the direction of the Nile. The commander of the fleet, Ahmose, and the commander dismounted and saluted the king, then asked, saying, "My lord, why does our army not attack the crumbling shepherds? Shouldn't our soldiers be on the wall of Thebes now?" The king said in a sad, heavy voice as he pointed towards the wall, "Look and see for yourself, commander." But Ahmose our father did not look calmly as they expected. "My eyes informed me of the despicable and brutal act, but how can we accept being led into the snares of Apophis when we know him? Is it permissible for us to stop fighting for Thebes and Egypt out of fear that our arrows will harm some of the women and children of our people?" King Ahmose said bitterly, "Do you think I should order the bodies of these miserable women and their children to be torn apart?" The commander said with enthusiasm and confidence, "Yes, my lord, it is an offering of struggle, just like our valiant soldiers who fall every now and then, and even like our martyr King Sekenre and our valiant deceased Ahmose. So why do we feel this pity over their disappearance that hinders our struggle? My lord, my heart tells me that my mother is our father among these miserable prisoners. If my feeling is true, I have no doubt that she is now praying to the Lord to make your love good above your mercy for her and her miserable sisters. And I am not the only one wounded among our soldiers, so let each of us put around his heart a shield of his faith and determination and let us attack." The king looked at his fleet commander for a long time, then turned his face to his courtiers and his commander, and the chamberlain Ha said calmly and was frowning and looking down, "Ahmose, our great father, has spoken the truth." The men breathed from the depths and they all shouted in one breath, "Yes. Yes. The fleet commander is right and let us attack." So the king turned to the commander and said with determination, "O commander, go to your soldiers and tell them that their king, who lost his grandfather and father for the sake of Egypt, and who does not hesitate to sacrifice himself for its sake, orders them to attack the wall of Thebes, which is armored with our hearts, and seize it, no matter what the cost." The commander quickly went and blew his trumpets, and the ranks of soldiers advanced, carrying weapons and with blank faces. The officers shouted in loud voices, "Amenemhet lives or Siknir dies." And immediately the most horrific battle ever fought by man began. The shepherds fired arrows, and the Egyptians responded to them. Their arrows shot open the chests of their women and tore the hearts of their children, and blood flowed abundantly. The women waved their heads to the soldiers and shouted in high, hoarse voices, "Strike us, and the Lord will help you, and avenge us." Then the Egyptians went crazy and attacked like predatory monsters whose hearts were hardened and thirsty for blood, and their screams resounded in the sides of the valley like the peals of thunder and the roar of lions. They rushed forward, not caring about the death that was upon them, as if they had lost feeling and awareness and turned into infernal machines. The battle was heated and the plague intensified, and blood flowed as if it were springs bursting in the chests. And the necks, and each attacker felt that there was a maddening in his heart that would not calm down until he buried his spear in the heart of one of the shepherds. The right wing was able, before midday, to silence several defensive positions, so men took the initiative to set up the siege stairs and climbed them with hearts that did not fear death, so they transferred the fight. From the field to the top of the fortified wall, some of them jumped to the roof of the inner wall and clashed with the enemy with spears and swords, and the attacks continued with violence and valor. The king was watching the fighting with vigilant eyes and sending help to the sites where the enemy was intense. He saw his soldiers climbing to the wall in the middle and 2 places in the middle. Al-Maysara, as the sun began to set in the middle of the sky, said, "My soldiers are exerting the effort of the Titans, but I fear that darkness will overtake us before we seize the entire wall, so we will resume tomorrow again." The king issued orders to new legions to attack, and the pressure of his men on the defenders of the impenetrable wall intensified, and they created new paths for themselves to the top. It appears that despair began to take hold of the shepherds after the Egyptians inflicted heavy losses on them, and after they saw their constant torrent as they climbed the stairs of the siege like groups of ants. Crawling on tree trunks, defensive positions collapsed at a speed that no one expected, and Ahmose's soldiers occupied entire points of the wall. The fall of the wall seemed inevitable and only needed time. Ahmose did not stop sending strong supplies, and an officer from the reconnaissance force penetrating into the camp came to him. In the fields surrounding Thebes, people spread from his face. He bowed to the king and said, "Great news, my lord. Apophis and his army are leaving the northern gates of Thebes like fugitives." The king was surprised and asked the officer, "Are you sure of what you say?" The man said with confidence and faith, "I saw with my own eyes the king of the shepherds riding and his guards, followed by the heavily armed army." Ahmose our father said, "Apophis realized the futility of defending the wall of Thebes after what he saw of the attacks of our soldiers and his army in the city not being able to defend itself well, so he fled. Ha said, Now I realize without a doubt that taking refuge with the women and children of warriors is an evil and a shame." I had hardly finished speaking when a new messenger came from the fleet. He greeted the king and said, "My lord, the fires of revolution have broken out in Thebes, and we witnessed from the fleet a violent fight taking place between the peasants and Nubians on the one hand, and the palace owners and shore guards on the other hand." Ahmose appeared worried and asked the officer, "Did the fleet fulfill its duty?" "Yes, sir, our ships approached the shore and fired arrows in abundance at the guards so as not to enable them to devote themselves to fighting the rebels." Relief appeared on the commander's face, and he asked the king for permission to return to his fleet to attack the shore. The king gave him permission and said to her happily, "The owners of the estates will not get away with their money this time." Ha said in a voice shaking with joy, "Yes, my lord, and soon the glorious Thebes will open its doors to you." But Apophis fled with his army. "We will not stop fighting until Horus Wiglu, the last man of the shepherds, falls from Egypt." The king returned to observing the fighting and saw his soldiers fighting on the steps of the siege and at the top of the wall, pressing on the shepherds retreating in front of them. Legions of soldiers carrying spears and swords rose in abundance and mounted the wall on all sides, surrounding the shepherds and killing and slaughtering them. He soon saw his soldiers tearing down the Hyksos flag and raising the flag. The flickering Thebes, then he saw the great gates of Thebes opening wide and his soldiers rushing inside, calling out his name. So he murmured, saying in a low voice, "Thebes, the source of my blood, the breeding ground of my body, and the breeding ground of my soul, open your arms and embrace to your tender chest your brave, righteous sons." Then he bent his head to hide a tear pulled from his ribs, and Hoa was to his right, praying and drying his eyes, his thin cheeks drooping. 13. More hours passed and the sun began to set towards setting, and the king and the two commanders, Naguib and Thebes, arrived, then Ahmose followed in their wake. They bowed to Ahmose in reverence and congratulated him on the victory. Ahmose said, "Before we congratulate each other, we must perform our duty toward the bodies of the heroes, soldiers, women, and children who were martyred for the sake of victory. Good, come to me all." The corpses were lying on the side of the field, on the roof of the wall, and behind the doors. They were covered with dust and soaked with blood, and the iron helmets had fallen from their heads. They were covered in a terrible silence of death. The soldiers raised them with respect and walked with them to one side of the camp and laid them side by side. They brought the women and children who had been torn apart by the arrows of their soldiers. They placed them in a secluded place, and the king headed to the shrine of the martyrs, followed by the chamberlain the three commanders, and the courtiers. When he approached the piled-up corpses, he bowed in silent, sad reverence, and his men did the same. Then he walked in slow steps, passing by them, as if he were reviewing them in a solemn ceremony, then he returned to where he lay. The women and children covered their naked bodies with linen covers, so a cloud of sadness shaded the king's face and his eyes darkened. He was awakened from his grief by the voice of the leader Ahmose, who was shouting in spite of himself in a trembling voice, saying, "Mother!" The king turned behind him and saw his commander kneeling in pain and grief in front of one of the corpses. The king took a closer look at her and recognized the lady as Ibana, and the horrific specter of annihilation appeared on her face. The king stood beside his kneeling commander, humbled and sad-hearted. He had great respect for the lady and knew her patriotism, courage, and virtue in raising children. Ahmose is undoubtedly the best of his commanders, and the king raised his head to the sky and said in a shaking voice, "O Lord, the worshipped Amun, the creator of the universe, the giver of life and the organizer of all things with his lofty law. These deposits of yours are returned to you according to your will, and in our world they lived for others and also died. They are dear pieces. Scattered from my heart, cover them with your mercy, and compensate them for what they lost in mortal life with a happy, everlasting life." The king turned to the chamberlain and said, "O Chamberlain, I want all of these bodies to be preserved and deposited in the western cemeteries of Thebes. By my life, the people most deserving of the land of Thebes are those who were martyred for its sake." Meanwhile, the messenger who had been sent by the king to his family in Thebes returned and presented a message to his master. The king was astonished and asked him, "Has my family returned to Habu?" The man said, "No, my lord." Ahmose unfolded the letter, which was addressed to Tututuri, and read, "My lord, supported by the spirit and blessing of Amun, I ask the Lord to make this letter of mine reach you. And Thebes has opened its gates to you and you have entered it at the head of the Salvation Army to heal its wounds, and to make the souls of Siknir and Camus happy. As for us, we will not leave Thebes. I have thought about the matter for a long time and have found that the best means by which we can participate with our tortured people. His suffering is that we remain in our exile, where we are now suffering the pain of loneliness and estrangement, until we break his shackles and remove his vengeance, so we enter Egypt in safety and share with him happiness and peace. Go on your way, supported by divine providence, liberate countries, and conquer fortresses, and purify the land of Egypt from its enemy and make no place for him in its lands. Come, then call us and we will come in safety." Ahmose raised his head and folded the letter, saying with disdain, "Tututuri says that she will not enter Egypt until we remove the last man from the shepherds from her. Ha said, our holy mother wants us to not stop fighting until we liberate Egypt." The king shook his head in agreement, so Ha asked, "Will the lord of Thebes not enter this evening?" Ahmose said, "No, Ha, my army will enter it alone, but I will enter it with my family after expelling the shepherds. We will all enter it as we all left it 10 years ago. Its people will be disappointed. Tell those who ask about me that I am pursuing the shepherds to throw them outside our sacred borders, and let those who love me follow me." 14. The king returned to the pharaonic tent, and was intending to issue an order to his commanders to enter the city in their traditional order to the tune of military music, but one of the army officers came and said, "My lord, some of the leaders of the revolution have asked me to ask permission for them to appear before you, so that they may present to you the Attic gifts from what they took in their revolution." Ahmose smiled and asked the officer, "Are you coming from the city?" "Yes, my lord." "Were the doors of the Temple of Amun opened?" "The revolutionaries opened it, my lord." "Why didn't the high priest come to greet us?" "They say, my lord, that he swore that no one of the shepherds would leave his seclusion while in Egypt, except as a slave or a prisoner." The king smiled and said, "Well, invite my people." The man left the tent and went to the city, and returned with many people following him, walking in groups, each group shopping for its gift, and he asked permission for the first group, and a group of Egyptians entered, naked except for those with a blanket around their waists, their faces expressing misery and poverty. And they pushed in their hands men from the shepherds whose heads were stripped and whose beards were matted and matted. Their foreheads, then they prostrated to the king until their foreheads touched the ground, and when they raised their faces to him, he saw their eyes overflowing with tears of joy and happiness, and the leader of the people said, "Our lord Ahmose bin Ahmose bin Siknari is the pharaoh of Egypt, its liberator and protector, and the lofty branch of that splendid city whose roots were martyred for the sake of the glorious Thebes, and whose coming was a mercy for us and atonement for the days that were bad for us." Ahmose said, smiling, "Welcome, my dear people. Their hopes are like mine, their pain is the source of my pain, and their skin color is the same as my skin color." The faces of the people were illuminated with a joyful light, and the eldest of them addressed the shepherds, saying, "Prostrate to Pharaoh, you most despicable of his servants." So the men prostrated themselves without any of them saying a word, and the man said, "My lord, these shepherds are among the group who owned the lands without right, as if they had inherited them from their fathers, successor to successor. They humiliated the Egyptians, treated them with humiliation, and forced them to do the hardest work with the lowest wages. They made them prey to poverty, hunger, disease, and ignorance. Then when they called them, they would say with contempt, 'Peasants,' and they felt sorry for them for leaving them alive. These are the tyrants of yesterday and the prisoners of today. We drove them to your Attic self as slaves of the most humble of your servants." The king smiled and said, "I thank you, my people, for your gift, and I congratulate you on regaining your sovereignty and freedom." The men bowed down to their king again and left the tent, and the soldiers led the shepherds to the prisoner camp. Then the second group entered, leading a large man with a bright white frame and torn clothes. The whips left clear marks on his back and arms. He fell exhausted at the king's feet, without his tormentors caring about him. They prostrated before their king for a long time, and one of them said, "Our lord is the pharaoh of Egypt, the son of the lord Amun, this evil-clad one." In the guise of humiliation, he was the chief of the police of Thebes, and he used to inflame our backs with his cruel whip for the most trivial reasons, so the Lord enabled us to do so. So we inflamed his back with our whips until his skin was torn, and we brought him to the king's camp to be added to his servants. So the king ordered the man to be taken away, and the soldiers took him, and he thanked his people for what they had done. The king gave permission to the third group, and they came to him, shopping for a man. As soon as the king saw him, he recognized him. He was Senmut, a judge of Thebes and the brother of a pig. The king gave him a calm look, and Senmut looked at him with an astonished look, with worried and astonished eyes that could hardly be believed. The men saluted the king, and their tongues said, "To you, O Pharaoh, we are driving the one who yesterday was the judge of Thebes. He used to swear justice and judge injustice at all times, so he brought the drinker of injustice to taste what he used to drink for the innocent." Ahmose said, addressing the judge, "O Senmut, you have been judging the Egyptians all your life, so force yourself this time to let them judge you." He gave it to his soldiers and thanked his loyal men. The last group came and was very enthusiastic and seething with anger, and surrounded a person who was wrapped in a linen curtain from his collar to his sandals, and they greeted the king, shouting, and their speaker said, "O Pharaoh of Egypt, protector of the Egyptians and avenger of them. We are some of those whose women and children the shepherds took and presented with them in a good battle, and he wanted may God avenge us on the oppressive Apophis, for we attacked his harem during his retreat, and without his knowledge, we kidnapped the woman who was dearer to him than himself. And we brought her to you so that you can avenge our women on her. The man approached the person hidden in a linen veil and removed the curtain from him. A woman appeared naked except for a veil around her middle, white and pure as light, with hair like golden wires around her crown, and anger, and pride appearing on her beautiful face. Ahmose was startled, and he looked at her and she looked at him, and the annoyance appeared on his face. Astonishment appeared on her face that erased the anger, rage, and pride that was evident in it, and he muttered in an inaudible voice while he did not wake up, "Princess Amun reads." Ha took off his cloak, approached the woman, and threw it on her. Ahmose shouted to his men, "Why are you mutilating this woman?" The leader of the people said, "She is the daughter of the chief butcher Apophis." Ahmose realized the embarrassment of his position among the angry people thirsty for revenge, so he said, "Do not allow anger towards yourselves to spoil your sacred morals, for the truly virtuous is the one who clings to his virtue during the outbreak of conscience and the whim of anger. And you are a people who respect women and do not kill prisoners." A man from the people of Mucha said, "O protector of the Egyptians, the relief for our chests is to send this woman's head to Apophis." Ahmose said, "Do you urge your king to be like Apophis, shedding blood and killing women? Leave the matter to me and leave in peace." So the people prostrated themselves before Pharaoh and left, and the king called one of his guard officers and ordered him in a low voice to take the princess to his pharaonic ship, and to take care of her. The king was suffering from a revolution in his heart and soul, and he could not bear to sit still. So he ordered his commander to enter Thebes at the head of the army, entering to victory and victory. When he turned to a poplar, he found him looking at him with anxious, confused, and compassionate eyes. 15. The field was empty, so the king headed towards the Nile, followed by his guards. He was urging his chariot drivers to speed up and drowning in dreams and thoughts. What a shock his heart was exposed to today! What surprise did he suffer? He did not think that he would meet Amun Reeds again, so he despaired of her. She appeared to him like a dream that illuminated his night for an hour and then was swallowed up by the darkness. But he saw her again, without waiting or thinking. The destinies cast her at his mercy, so she suddenly became in his private possession, so much that his chest trembled and his heart skipped a beat. To the point, hot emotions aroused within him, reviving his sweet memories again, and he immersed himself in its tender stream, forgetting everything. But did she know him, I wonder, and if you did not know him, do you still remember the happy merchantess Thebans, whose life was saved from certain death, and to whom she said, with the heart beating and tears flowing, "Goodbye"? Who did she yearn for during his exile and send him a message that contained as much love in its lines as fire in a stone? Is her heart still beating its first beat in the cabin of the pharaonic ship? Oh my God! Why does he feel that he is approaching limitless happiness? Does his heart believe him or deceive him? The king saw her miserable appearance when the rebels pushed her towards him, and his strong body trembled and a shudder ran through him, and he wondered sadly while the angry people around her were spitting on her, cursing her, and cursing her father. And he remembered the anger, rage, and pride that was waving in her face. Would her anger be silenced if she knew that she was the prisoner of Thebans? He felt anxiety that he did not feel in the most critical situations. His boat reached the shore and he landed on the pharaonic ship. The officer who had entrusted him with the princess called him and asked him, "How is the princess?" She was placed, my lord, in a special room, and new clothes were brought to her and food was offered to her, but she refused to touch it, and she treated the soldiers with contempt and called them slaves, but she was treated well as ordered by His Majesty the King. The king seemed uncomfortable, and walked with calm steps to the bedroom. One of the guards opened the door and answered it after the king entered. The bedroom was small and elegant, illuminated by a large lamp hanging from its ceiling. To the right of the entrance, the princess sat on a comfortable sofa in a simple linen dress, combing her messy hair. The rebels sent him a big braid, So he looked at her smiling and saw her looking at him in astonishment and strangeness, and she could not believe her eyes, and she seemed to him as if she was in confusion and doubt, so he greeted her and said, "Good evening, princess." She did not answer him, but her confusion and doubt increased when she heard his voice. The young man looked at her for a long time with passion and fascination, so he asked her, "Do you lack anything?" She looked at his face, then looked up at his helmet, lowered it to his armor, and asked him, "Who are you?" Was Ahmose the pharaoh of Egypt? Denial appeared in the look in her eyes, and he wanted to make her more confused, so he took off his helmet and placed it on Juan, telling himself that she could not believe her eyes. He saw her looking at his strangely curly hair, and he said as if in amazement, "Why are you looking at me like this, as if you know someone similar to me?" She did not know what to say and did not respond. He longed to hear her voice and seek her affection, so he said to her, "Suppose I told you that my name is Isphines, so will you answer me?" She had barely heard Isphines' name before she stood up and shouted to him, "So you are Isphines?" He took a step closer to her, looked at her with tenderness, and took hold of her wrist as he said, "I am Isphines, Princess Amun reads." She pulled her wrist tightly and said, "I don't understand anything." Ahmose smiled and said gently, "What do the names mean? Yesterday I was called Isphines and today I am called Ahmose, but I am one person and one heart." How strange. How can you say you are one person? You were a merchant selling jewelry and dwarfs, and today you fight and wear the clothes of kings. Why not? Yesterday I was wandering through Thebes in disguise, and today I am leading my people to liberate my country and regain my stolen throne. She looked at him for a long time, and he was confused to understand what it was, and he tried to approach her again, but she repelled him with a wave of her hand, and the features of her face froze, and cruelty and pride appeared in her eyes. He felt disappointment and coldness that included his hopes and killed the clouds of hope singing in his chest, and he heard her saying sternly, "Stay away from me." He said to her with hope, "Don't you remember?" But she interrupted him before he could finish his words, saying, as she was overcome by the anger for which her people were famous, "I remember, and I will always remember, that you are a lowly spy." He felt a horrific shock that made him frown, and he said angrily, "Princess, don't you realize that you are addressing a king? What kind of king is this?" Anger seized him and he said sternly, "The Pharaoh of Egypt." She said sarcastically, "And my father, will he be one of your governors?" The king's anger increased, and his pride overcame all his emotions. He said, "Your father is not worthy to be one of my governors, but he is the usurper of the throne of my country. I defeated him severely and made him flee from the northern gates of Thebes, leaving his daughter captive in the hands of the people he oppressed. I will follow him with my armies until he takes refuge in the deserts, which threw him into our valley. Don't you realize this? As for me, I am the legitimate king of this valley because I am a descendant of the glorious pharaohs of Thebes, and because I am a victorious leader who reclaimed my country forcefully and powerfully." She said coldly and sarcastically, "I am blessed to have a king whose people excel at fighting women." How strange, do you not know that you owe these people your life? You are at their mercy, and if they had killed you, they would not have violated the sunnah that your father followed in exposing women and children to the arrows of fighters. Does it put me on an equal footing with those women? Why not? Excuse me, O king. It has become too much for me to imagine that I am like one of your women, or that one of my people is like one of your people, unless masters and slaves are equal. Don't you know that our army left Thebes without feeling the humiliation of the vanquished? They used to say with disdain, "Revenge our slaves, and we will attack them." The king became mad and was overcome with anger at his command, so he shouted, "Who are the slaves and who are the masters? You don't realize anything, you arrogant girl, because you were born in the arms of this valley that inspires glory and pride, and if your birth had been delayed by a century, you would have been born in the coldest deserts of the north, and when you heard someone calling you, princess, or calling your father, king, from those deserts your people came and usurped the sovereignty of our valley and made its honor humiliated. Then they said out of ignorance and arrogance that they are princes and that we are slave peasants, and that they are white and that we are brown, and today justice takes its course and returns to the master his sovereignty. And the slave turns into his servitude, and whiteness becomes the mark of strikers in the cold deserts, and brownness is the symbol of the masters of Egypt purified by the light of the sun. This is the indisputable right. Anger raged in the princess's heart and blood rushed to her face, and she said with contempt, "I know that my ancestors came to Egypt from the northern desert, but how did you forget that they were masters of the desert before they became masters of this valley through their strength? They were and still are masters of pride and chivalry, who know only the sword as a way to achieve their goal. They do not hide in the clothes of merchants in order to stab today those who prostrated to them yesterday." He stared at her with a harsh, searching look. He saw that she was proud, conceited, and cruel, unyielding and fearless, embodying the rude and condescending qualities of her people. His anger increased, and he felt a burning desire to subjugate and humiliate her, especially after she had humiliated his feelings with her pride and arrogance. He said in a calm, condescending voice, "I see no reason for him to let me to continue arguing with you, and I must not forget that I am a king and that you are a prisoner. Captive as you wish, but I will never be humiliated. Rather, you seek refuge in my mercy, and this gives you courage. My courage has never left me. Ask your men who treacherously kidnapped me and they will tell you about my courage and my contempt for them in the most critical and dangerous times for me." He shrugged his broad shoulders in disdain, and turned to the brothers, took his helmet and placed it on his head, and before he took another step, he heard her say, "You truly said that I am a prisoner, and your ship is not a place suitable for prisoners, so join me with the prisoners of my people." He looked at her angrily and annoyed and said, teasing and frightening her, "The matter is not as you imagine. Usually, the male prisoners are made slaves, while the women are attached to the harem of the victorious king." She said, her eyes widening, "But I am a princess." "You are a princess, and now you are nothing but a prisoner. Every time I mention that I saved your life one day, I get crazy." He said quietly, "May this memory be revived. Thanks to it, I saved your life from the hands of the revolutionaries who wished to send your head to Apophis." He turned his back to her and left the room, angry and angry. The guards saluted him and ordered them to sail to the north of Thebes. He walked to the bow of the ship with heavy, slow steps, filling his chest with the humid night air. The ship soon descended with the Nile current that had been flowing since time immemorial, cutting through the darkness to the north of Thebes. So the king sent his eyes to the city, fleeing from the worries of his soul. The light was shining from the ships of the fleet anchored on the city's shore, and as for the towering palaces, they were immersed in darkness after their fleeing owners had abandoned them. In the distance, from between the palaces and gardens, the lights of torches carried by the happy watchmen appeared. The breeze echoed their rising voices with cheers and chants, and a smile broke out on his wide mouth, and he realized that Thebes was receiving the Salvation Army as it was accustomed to receiving its victorious armies and its immortal feasts. The ship continued to approach the pharaonic palace until it was parallel to it in its course, and the king saw the palace illuminated, with light shining from its windows and garden, and he knew that Hor was supervising its preparation and purification, and that he had truly returned to performing his first job in the palace of Siknir. Ahmose saw the port of the palace garden, and the painful memory came back to him, the night she became pregnant. The pharaonic ship took him to the far south, with blood flowing from behind it. The king resumed walking back and forth on the bow of the ship, and his gaze turned several times to the princess's closed bedroom, and then he asked, frustrated and dissatisfied, "Why did they bring her to me? Why did they bring it to me?" 16. On the morning of the second day, the captain, and the advisors rose early to visit the king in his ship anchored north of Thebes. The king received them in the cabin, and they prostrated before him. Said in his calm voice, "May God bless your morning, O victorious king. We have left behind us the gates of Thebes, whose heart beats with joy, and is shaken by longing for the dawning of light. The forehead of her savior and liberator." Ahmose said, "Let Thebes rejoice, but the meeting will be when the Lord decrees victory." Said, "It has spread among the people that their king is on the way to the north, and that he welcomes whoever is able to join him." Do not ask, my lord, about the enthusiasm that overflowed in the hearts of the youth, nor about their eagerness for the officers to include them in the army of the idolized Ahmose. The king smiled and asked his men, "Have you visited the temple of Amun?" Ha said, "Yes, my lord, we all visited him," and the soldiers rushed to him, stroking its corners, burying their faces in the dirt, and hugging its priests. The altar was overflowing with offerings, and the priests sang the hymn of the worshipped Lord, and their prayers echoed in the sides of the temple. Longing melted the hearts, and the Thebans all joined together in unified prayer. As for Amun, he leaves his isolation. The king smiled, and a glance appeared from him. The leader, Ahmose, saw a silent and depressed son, so he motioned for him to approach. The leader approached his master, and the king put his hand on his shoulder and said to him, "Bear your share of harm, O Ahmose, and remember that the symbol of your family is courage and sacrifice." The commander bowed his head in thanks, and was touched by the king's compassion for him. Ahmose looked at his men and said, "Advise me who I have chosen as ruler of Thebes, and to whom I will entrust the arduous task of organizing it." Commander Moab said, "The best person fit for this dangerous position is the sincere and wise man, Ha. But Habad says, My duty is to ensure the service of my master, not to neglect him." Ahmose said, "You are right, and I cannot do without you." Ha said, "There is a virtuous man with great knowledge and experience, known for his wisdom and originality of opinion. He is Tuti Amun, the steward of the temple of Amun. If my master wishes, let him entrust good affairs to him." Ahmose said, "We have appointed him as governor of Tibur." Then the king invited his men to have breakfast at his table. 17. The hours of the day passed and the army bandaged its wounds and took its rest, amusement, singing and drinking. The soldiers rushed ahead of the Thebans to their families' homes, so hearts embraced and souls mingled, and the Thebans became full of affection and kindness as if they were the beating heart of the world. As for Ahmose, he did not leave his ship, and he called the officer in charge of guarding the princess and asked him about her. The man said to him, she had spent the night without having tasted food, and he was thinking about putting her on another ship and entrusting her to trustworthy guards, but he did not reach a firm resolve in his thoughts, and he had no doubt that Ha was dissatisfied with her presence on his ship, and he was certain that the guard was growing. He had to have the daughter of Apophis gain this favor with him, and he knew him well, and knew that nothing occupied his heart except the struggle for Thebes, but as for him, his emotions were thirsty and overflowing, and he was too tired to refrain himself from hovering around the chamber and its companion, or to divert her from his infatuation with her as he was of wrath and anger, for anger does not kill love, but it obscures it for a period of time, just as fog obscures the face of a polished mirror for a while, then it clears and purity returns to it. Therefore, he did not give in to despair, and began to say to himself consolingly, "Perhaps it has traces of defeated pride and arrogance. She is in captivity, and perhaps her anger will be silenced, and she will find that the hatred she shows is not the love she hides, so she will soften and submit and give love its due just as she gave anger its due. Isn't she the owner of the cabin that saved his life and gave him kindness and affection? Wasn't she the one who worried about his absence, so she wrote him a letter of humiliation containing the suppressed groan of love? So how can her emotions wither for the sake of a revolution of pride and anger?" He waited for the afternoon, then he shrugged his broad shoulders in disdain and went to the bedroom, and the guards greeted him and made room for him, so he entered with great hope, and saw her sitting in a stoic and calm manner, with depression and boredom appearing in her blue eyes. Her depression pained him, and he said to himself, she was good, despite her spaciousness, and it was cramped for her, so how could she be confined in this small room? He stood in front of her rigidly, so she sat up straight and looked up at him with cold eyes. He said to her gently, "How was your night?" She did not answer and lowered her head, looking at the ground. He cast an interesting look at her head, shoulders, and chest, and repeated his question, saying, as he thought his hope was close, "How was your night?" It seemed as if she did not want to break the silence, but she raised her head sharply and said, "It was my worst night." He ignored her tone and asked her, "Why, are you missing anything?" she said without changing her tone. I lack everything. How? I have ordered the officer assigned to guard you. She interrupted him bitterly, saying, don't bother mentioning this. I lack everything I love. I lack my father, my people, and my freedom. But I have everything I hate. These clothes, this food, this room, and these guards. He was disappointed again and felt the collapse of his hopes and the disappearance of his hope. He was frozen in his thoughts and said to her, do you want me to break your captivity and send you to your father? She shook her head violently and said vehemently, no. He looked at her in amazement and bewilderment, but she responded with such a tone, saying, so that it would not be said that the daughter of Apophis pleaded with her father's great enemy or that she ever deserved to be mourned. He became angry at her arrogance and pride, and said to her, do not be embarrassed to show your arrogance out of reassurance of my mercy. You lied. Then his face became dark and he looked at her with a harsh look and said, oh, you little girl who does not know what sadness or pain is. Do you know the punishment that insulting the king entails? Have you seen a woman flogged before today? If I wanted, I could make you kneel at the feet of my youngest soldier, asking for forgiveness and repentance. He looked at her to see the effect of his threat on her soul, and he found her challenging him with her harsh eyes, not lowering them, and anger rushing to her like it would to all of her people, and she said sharply, we are a people whose hearts do not know fear, and our pride will not be humbled until the heavens fold the hands of humans. In his anger, he wondered whether he would try to humiliate her. Why doesn't he humiliate her and trample her pride with his foot? Isn't she his captive and can he make her one of his maids? But he was not satisfied with this passion. He coveted what was sweeter and more beautiful. When disappointment overtook him, his pride aroused and his anger intensified, so he abstained from humiliating her, even though he revealed what was hidden, so he said in a tone like hers of pride, my will does not require that you be tortured, so you will not be tortured for that reason. The most amazing thing is for a person to think of torturing a beautiful slave girl like you. But a proud princess. This was before you became a prisoner in my hands. As for me, I would rather include you in my harem than torture you, and my will is in force. You will know that your will applies to yourself and your people, not to me, and that you will not touch me alive. He shrugged his shoulders in disdain, but she added, it is one of our inherited customs that if one of us falls into the traps of humiliation and is unable to survive, he abstains from eating until he fulfills his duty in honor. He said sarcastically, really, but I saw the judges of Thebes being led to me and prostrating themselves humbly, asking in their eyes for pardon and forgiveness. Then her face sank and she remained silent. The king was fed up with her talking and was suffering from the bitterness of disappointment. He could not bear to stay. He said as he was about to leave the room, there will be no need to abstain from food. He left the cabin angry and dissatisfied, intending to transfer her to another ship, but his anger had hardly subsided when he was alone in the cabin when he changed his intention and did not issue his order. 18. Unlike the chamberlain, he appeared before the king in his cabin and said, my lord, messengers have come from Apophis asking permission to appear before you. Ahmose was surprised and asked him, what do they want? The chamberlain said, they said that they carry a message for your higher self. Ahmose said, call them quickly. So the chamberlain left the cabin and sent an officer to the messengers, and returned to his master to wait. It was not long before the messengers came with a group of officers of the guard, and they were 3, with the eldest leading and 2 following him, carrying an ivory box. They were, as was evident from their loose clothing from the veil, white faces, long beards. They raised their hands in salute without bowing, and stood in apparent arrogance. Ahmose responded to their greeting with pride and asked them, what do you want? Their leader said in an arrogant foreign accent, Commander. But Ha did not enable him to complete his sentence, so he said to him with his natural calm, you are speaking to the Pharaoh of Egypt, O messenger of Apophis. The leader said, the war is still raging and has not yet been decided, and as long as we have men and weapons in our hands, Apophis, the Pharaoh of Egypt, has no partner. So Ahmose motioned to his chamberlain to remain silent and said to the messenger, "Speak about what you have come for." The leader said, "O leader, on the day of the withdrawal from Thebes, the peasants kidnapped Her Highness the Pharaonic Princess Amenredides, our lord, King Ahmose, Pharaoh of Egypt, and the son of God Set, and our lord wants to know whether his daughter is alive or whether the peasants killed her. Does your lord remember what he did to our women and children during the siege of Thebes? Did he not mention how he exposed them to the arrows of their sons and husbands, tearing them apart with evil, while your cowardly soldiers were armored with them?" The man said sharply, "My lord does not shirk the consequences of his work, and war is a struggle for death and defeat, so no mercy can be sought in it." So Ahmose shook his head with distaste and said, "Rather, war is a contest between men, in which the strong decide and the weak oppose it. For us, it is a struggle that should not overshadow the chivalry and religion in our souls. However, I wonder how the king asks about his daughter, and that is his knowledge and this is his opinion about war." The messenger said with pride, "My master is asking questions for a purpose within himself, but he is not asking for mercy nor is he showing pity." Ahmose thought carefully, and he did not lose sight of the motive that led his enemy to ask about his daughter, and so he said clearly and in a tone that showed contempt, "Go back to your master and tell him that the peasants are honorable people who do not assassinate women, and that Egyptian soldiers refrain from killing their prisoners. And that his daughter is a captive who enjoys nobility. Her captors." The man seemed relieved and said, "This word of yours has saved the lives of thousands of your people, women and men, who were captured by the king, and whose lives were held hostage by the life of Her Highness the princess." Ahmose said to him, "The princess's life depends on their lives." The man was silent for a moment, then said, "I have been ordered not to return until I see her for myself." Denial appeared on his face, but Ahmose took the initiative to the messenger and said, "You will see it for yourself." The leader pointed to the ivory box carried by his followers and said, "This box contains some of her clothes. Will she give us permission to leave it in her room?" The king was silent for a while, then said, "This is yours." But Ha leaned towards his master and whispered, saying, "We should examine the clothes first." So the king agreed with his chamberlain's opinion, and ordered the chamberlain to place the box in the king's hands. Then he opened it with his own hands and took out all the clothes it contained, one by one. He found a small bag, so he grabbed it and opened it, and in it was a necklace with an emerald heart. The king's heart trembled when he saw it, and he mentioned how the princess had selected it from among the pearls. When he was called Isfinus and sold pearls, his face turned red. "As for Hoa," he said, "is prison a place suitable for decoration?" The messenger said, "This necklace is the princess's favorite ornament. If the leader wishes, we can keep it, otherwise we will take it with us." Ahmose said, "There is no harm in keeping it." Then the king turned to the officers and ordered them to accompany the messengers to the princess's bedroom, and the messengers left and the officers followed them. 19. On the same evening, the army was joined by forces coming from the south, from the coaches of Apollonopolis and Hierakonpolis, and small ships loaded with weapons and siege domes directed from Ahmose docked in the port of Thebes, and their captain announced to the king that he would soon receive a force of chariots and trained knights. Men from Thebes and Habu joined the army, and Ahmose's army was upset with the men it lost and its number exceeded the day it invaded the borders. The king saw no reason to remain in Thebes any longer than he remained. So he ordered his commanders to prepare to march north at dawn tomorrow, and the soldiers bid farewell from Thebes and its people, and turned away from amusement and supplications to welcome the struggle and the executioner. At the beginning of dawn, the soldiers blew their trumpets, and the massive army moved in ranks like the waves of the sea, with the vanguards leading it, the king and his guards marching at the forefront, and the chariot squad followed by the other squads. The fleet took off under the command of Ahmose, ploughing the waters of the Nile with its strong units. They all leapt to fight, and victory sharpened their will, making it like iron or more solid. The army was received in the villages with overwhelming enthusiasm, and the peasants rushed to its path, shouting, waving flags and palm leaves. He crossed his path safely, and he became in Shinawa and entered it without resistance. Then it was evening in Kasi, and its gates were opened for him, and they all spent the night in Kasi, and they resumed their march with dawn, and they continued their walk until they approached Capto Square. And the valley that ended with the city appeared to them, and here the army included a sad silence and memories floated through their heads, and Ahmose mentioned the defeat that befell the Theban army in this valley had lasted for 10 years or more, and he remembered the death of his valiant grandfather, Sikanari, with whose blood this land was filled with blood. His gaze burned on the side of the field as he wondered, where did he fall? He looked towards Hor, and saw his face swollen and his eyes filled with tears. He was greatly moved and said, what a painful memory! Ah said with a shaking voice and panting breaths, it is as if I am listening to the souls of the martyrs that populate the atmosphere of this holy place. Commander Moab said, this land has drunk so much from the blood of our fathers. Hor dried his tears and said to the king, let us all pray, my lord, for the soul of our martyr King Siknir and his brave soldiers. Ahmose, his commander, and his entourage got out and they all prayed fervently. 20. The army entered the city of Captos and waved the Egyptian flag on its wall. The soldiers chanted long tributes to the memory of Sikanari. Then the army marched to Tintoe without meeting the slightest resistance. Dios also recaptured the polis of Pava. Then he marched on the road to Abydos, expecting to meet shepherds in its valley, but he did not find a man. From the enemy, Ahmose was astonished and asked, where is Apophis and where are his powerful armies? Ha said, perhaps he does not want to meet our wheels with his foot. Where does this chase take place? Who knows, my lord? Perhaps it will last until we face the walls of Hoares, the impregnable fortress of shepherds whose walls they built over a century ago, and it will bleed the heart of Egypt before our soldiers penetrate it. Abydos opened its doors to the Salvation Army, and the victorious army entered it, and it was at rest for the day. Ahmose was thirsty for war in the hope that he might meet his enemy in a decisive battle, and because he longed to be immersed in fighting in order to forget the desires of his soul and erase the sorrows of his heart, but Apophis refused him this comfort, and he found his thoughts hovering around the stubborn captive. And his heart was fighting for her because of the feelings he had for her. He mentioned his dreams when he thought that the happiest of fates were the ones that led her to capture him, and when he aspired to turn the ship of captivity into a paradise of love. Then he mentioned what her pride and anger had done to him, and how she had made him sick, deprived of the most delicious fruits when they were ripe, and his desire for love was strong and irresistible, so it was swept away. With its flowing current, obstacles of hesitation and pride, he went to the ship and went to the enchanted room and entered, and she was sitting in her usual position on the sofa, wrapped in one of the delicate dresses of Memphis. It was as if she knew his footsteps, so she did not raise her head to him and remained looking at what was between her feet, and his eager gaze ran over her parted hair, her forehead, and her drooping eyelids, and he felt a shudder in his chest. And he felt the desire to throw himself on top of her and press her between his arms with all his strength and determination, but she suddenly raised her head and glared at him. With a cold look, he remained motionless where he was, then asked her, "Did the messengers visit you?" She said in an emotionless tone, "Yes." He looked around the room until he settled on the ivory box and said, "I have given them permission to deliver this box to you." She said briefly and in a voice that was not devoid of harshness, "Thank you." His heart was relieved and he said, "In the box was the necklace with an emerald heart." Her lips quivered and she wanted to speak, but she suddenly changed her mind and closed her mouth in a state of confusion. Ahmose said gently, "The messengers said that this necklace is dear to you." She shook her head violently as if she was denying herself an accusation and said, "I actually wore it more than anything because the palace which made it a talisman to protect against harm and evil." He became aware of her evasion, but he did not despair and said, "I thought that this was for other reasons, as evidenced by the cabin of the pharaonic ship." Her face turned red and she said angrily, "I do not remember yesterday's whim today, and it would be nice of you to speak to me as an enemy should speak to a captive." He saw her face hard and rigid, so he swallowed the disappointment again, but he wanted to conceal his emotions, so he said, "Didn't you know that we include the women of our enemies in the harem of our palaces?" She said sharply, "Except like me." Do you return to the threat of fasting? I don't need it anymore. He looked at her with a suspicious look and asked her sarcastically, how do you defend yourself? She showed him a small weapon in her hands, no longer than a fingernail, and said reassuringly, look, this is a poison dagger. If I scratch my skin with it, the poison circulates in my blood and kills me in moments. The messenger passed it to me while I was unaware of your supervision. I knew that my father would place in my hands what I would pronounce on myself if injustice touched me or someone harassed me. Ahmose became angry, frowned, and said, is this the secret of the box? Damn those who trust the word pig among the shepherds with filthy beards. Betrayal runs through your veins, but I see you misunderstanding your father's message. He thrust this dagger at you to kill me with. She shook her head mockingly and said, you do not understand Apophis. He refuses to live in dignity or die in dignity. As for his enemy, he will destroy him himself, as he is accustomed to eliminating his enemies. Ahmose hit the ground with his foot and said with great anger, why all this trouble? What makes me sad about a slave girl like you who is blinded by vanity, pride, and a corrupt nature? In the past, I imagined you to be something that had nothing of your reality, so crush on all illusions. The king turned away from her and left the room, and outside he called her chief guard and said to him, let the prisoner be transferred to another ship under strict guard. The man left the ship with a tight chest and a dark face, and hurried back to the camp.